Thanks for tuning in to the World XP podcast. If you're enjoying the content, please drop us up, drop a like, and let us know your thoughts below in the comments. Also, please consider supporting our podcast via the link below. It really helps us out. Welcome, Nathaniel, to the World XP podcast. This one, for those listening, was one that came out of left field for me. I got a email randomly one day from a guy that worked at a publishing company. He was like, "Hey, I've got this guy who wrote this really interesting book on Madagascar. Do you want to talk to him?" And I was like, yeah, it sounds actually quite interesting, because the only times that I've heard about Madagascar were from the movie and the Penguins of Madagascar, which is not obviously what goes on in real life on that place. But I really appreciate your time and welcome.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
So just quickly, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, kind of how you ended up in this world of researching Madagascar, a little bit of your background, so the people listening kind of can understand where you're coming from?
Sure, be happy to. So my name is Nathaniel Adams, and I'm an attorney in the United States. Been practicing law for over 15 years, although currently, especially after doing this book on Madagascar, I've found that traveling and writing is much more interesting than practicing law. So I'm currently doing more of that than serving as a lawyer. But that's my training. As far as my interest in Madagascar, that goes back decades. So when I was in college, I was studying French and was supposed to go to France as part of a student exchange program, semester abroad program. That fell through for various reasons. I was looking for a French-speaking country that I could go and study in, and my semester abroad counselor at the time in college, he said, "We've got some programs in French Africa." And he listed a few of them. A couple of them didn't sound that interesting. Then he said Madagascar. And I said, wait a second, I don't know much about Madagascar, but that island off the coast of Africa looks like a pretty cool place. So I ended up going there for 4 months in college, living with the family, and really sort of fell in love with the country. I've been back several times since, still have a number of friends there. And then on my most recent trip, well, actually the one that led to this book, I was looking for a good English language book to take with me to learn more about what had gone on in Madagascar since I'd been there before. And there really wasn't a good one, at least that was comprehensive, that was, well written, interesting to read. And I thought, why don't I try to write one? So when I went to Madagascar in 2019, I made some good contacts with people who had high-level contacts in the government. Those led to some really good interviews. One thing led to another, and I thought, you know what, I've got enough material for a book here, and I just ran with it.
Fair enough. That's very interesting that you ended up with these interviews. So as somebody who does, I'll say, pseudo interviews, I do some of interviewing on here, but generally they're more conversational. How did you find interviewing people in a government in a situation as the one in Madagascar? As for those listening, we'll get to later, it's quite corrupt. And so when you go into these situations, just out of my own curiosity, how was that like? Was each situation unique? Did it depend on where the person was within the government itself? Like, how did you go into, because for me, I can imagine being a little bit, maybe hesitant is the right word, but like being like, oh, I don't know if I should ask this question, because if you're writing something, you want to get to the bottom of whatever you're writing. And sometimes you have to ask some uncomfortable questions. But in a situation like that, where there's always that underlying threat of like corruption and potentially violence, did you experience that? How was that for you?
Yeah, I thought, I was nervous going into some of the interviews for a couple of reasons. One, these were some very high-level officials. And to be honest, I'd never interviewed anyone that powerful before. I mean, I actually interviewed the former president of the country. And so that's something, you want to be well prepared for and that you're a little bit nervous going into. But the other thing I would say is that no one really speaks English in Madagascar.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was doing these interviews in French, and my French is pretty good. I studied it for a number of years, but doing these interviews in a second language was an added layer of pressure, of uncertainty going into it. As far as the content of the interviews, people were pretty open, and even though I wasn't officially a journalist, I was there as more of as a private citizen doing journalistic work. They were really excited to talk about their country, about their past, about the things that are going on in Madagascar today. And it's interesting. One of the first guys I talked to was a senator, and he said, you know what, when you might meet a lot of people here, but no one's really going to talk to you and tell you the truth. No one's going to let you see the inside of Madagascar. And so that worried me a little bit that, no one was going to take me seriously, or because I was an outsider, they weren't going to trust me enough to do that. But I found the exact opposite. And hopefully that comes through in the book. I think there are some really good insights. I think I did get to the bottom of a lot of things and hopefully prove that person wrong.
Yeah, for sure. So, you mentioned senator. What is the structure of their government?
Yeah, so I would call it a quasi-democracy right now. Like a lot of countries around the world, they have elections, but the leaders in power sort of skew those elections in their favor. Um, so there's a president, there's, as we have in the United States, a Senate, a National Assembly, sort of like the House of Representatives that we have here in the U.S. And as I said, their elections are mostly free and fair, although there is quite a bit of corruption. Um, the real threats to the current president, for example, are sort of sidelined through legal and underhanded moves that make him less of a threat to the president, who's up for re-election next year, by the way.
Hmm.
So it's a different place, but a lot of developing countries are dealing with the same issues that Madagascar is dealing with right now.
Yeah. So, so a few years ago, I was in South Africa for a little under a month, and I got to meet and experience a lot of different, all over the place, from all the way from Johannesburg to Cape Town to on safari to small villages in between. And I took a lot of things, a lot of lessons away from that experience. Most notably, I think one of the things that struck me the most was how in some of the cities you can go from it looking straight like an American city to 1 block away, there's huts and like absolute poverty. You mentioned
Mhm.
in one of the talking points that the annual per capita income is about $500, which is the same as 40 years ago. Is have you did you find that there was that stark contrast between like the current president and some of the well-off people that you interviewed, and then like like were these border like these barriers or not barriers, like was it fairly obvious where like the rich people stopped living and then it like went into everybody else, or like how did you find that when you were there?
Yeah, big inequalities of wealth and income in Madagascar. Um, we saw that across the board, not just in cities, but even in rural areas. There were people who I don't know if you knew this, but 80% of the world's vanilla comes from Madagascar.
Mm,
So when you go to the vanilla region, for example, you see these huge houses of these people who have these giant tracts of land and they control all of the vanilla production. And then everybody else lives in shacks and huts. So that's just one example. But, I called the book The Tragedy of Madagascar. And there have been a number of theories put forward as to why Madagascar remains so poor. And one of them is that it's a theory called elite capture, meaning the elites of the country have captured all the resources, all the power for themselves, and they don't give it up. And that means political power, that means economic power. They basically hoard as much of it as they can for themselves. Um, and the rest of the population just has to survive any way that they can. So there's a lot of that going on too.
yeah. I almost wonder if the comparison is more apt to like some of the Caribbean islands that have various resources. Um, that's really interesting. So I know, so they were colonized by the French, but when you look back at the history of the people that lived there, does it mirror a lot of the other colonization patterns in terms of they were kind of isolated, and then the French show up and kind of gut the place of natural resources, and then they left when the World Wars started. Like that general timeline, or was there more of a because it's in its own like place, really? Like it's part of Africa, obviously, but it's kind of its own place. Did it follow that timeline, or was it kind of its own thing?
Yeah, no, generally, yes. it was colonized by the French in the late 19th century, right around 1890, 1896. In that period is when the colonization really heated up. And then it became free in 1960. So almost a full 100 years of colonization. Yeah, not a lot of economic advancement during that time. A lot of the resources taken by the French. So to this day, you still don't have a very popular image of the French in that island. In fact, I would say that as an American going to Madagascar, I was much more popular, much more in demand than as a Frenchman who might go there, just because I wasn't one of the former colonizers. So that still resonates. They still speak French, so there's that legacy. One of their largest trading partners is still France, just because of the legacy of dealing with France. The colonization period itself, there are a couple large-scale revolts, rebellions. 1947, right after World War II, you mentioned, that's a time when a lot of countries were trying to break free from their colonial masters. It was a very violent time, a very violent year in Madagascar. There was a rebellion put down very violently by the French. So that saved them some time. But eventually, in 1960, France gave up, turned it over to Madagascar. Whether they were ready for independence or not, and that's a big question with a lot of African countries. I mean, I think in the Congo there was something like, 25 college graduates at the time of independence. It wasn't that dire in Madagascar, but they were left to fend for themselves, and they've made scant progress since then, as I point out in my book.
Yeah. It's always a difficult one, right? Because you want the people who are living in wherever to kind of have the freedom to not be beholden to whatever country or power that it is. But then you look at colonialism as a whole, like I'm not trying to condone or defend or whatever, but there's certain positive aspects that come out of that. With you look at the technology that's brought oftentimes, or sometimes the influx of trading and infrastructure of, like, a lot of these places, when you look at the most advanced areas, they were kind of constructed by, right, in South Africa, by the British or by whoever. And so I always have this kind of pondering question of, like, now they've left, and now what? Because it doesn't seem like there's just like this vacuum that exists. And you mentioned again in the talking points that you've got these two guys that have basically been fighting over power since the last 20 years or so.
Right,
And so it
right.
turns into, like, all these people that are living there are kind of beholden to these two guys who are basically just having a squabble over what, like, if these two people were working at some random company, nobody would care. But the job that they're fighting for happens to be the president of this island. And so
Right.
it affects everybody else in this way. What are your thoughts, I guess, on, well, one, that situation, on these two guys, but two, just like, if you were to take a step back into the colonial picture and say, or maybe Madagascar wasn't ready for independence, but, like, if the French were never there, then where are we looking at them from this standpoint? Because there's two sides to that coin, right? Where they come in and they kind of insert themselves, but then they leave, and then the vacuum is still there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes great sense. And I want to be clear. I don't want to make it sound like I don't think Madagascar should not have been independent in
Of
1960.
course.
Of course they should have, right? They're their own country, their own island, so they should rule themselves. But they have not made a lot of progress since then. And you brought up the political situation today, where these two men, Mark Ravalomanana and Andrei Rajoelina, don't try to pronounce those names
I
too often.
didn't try to pronounce them on purpose.
The Malagasy names are notoriously difficult to pronounce. So those two have been fighting over power for the last 20 years. So the older guy, Mark, we'll just call him Mark, he was president when the younger guy, Andrei, was the mayor of the capital city. And they started squabbling basically over business plans by the mayor. And the president feared that he was becoming too powerful and sort of becoming too popular, more than the president himself. So he tried to shut down some of his businesses. The younger guy, the mayor, took to the streets, said, we're going to overthrow the president. He's being unfair to me and to a lot of other businessmen. He eventually overthrew him in 2009. He got crushed by the international media and at home for overthrowing the democratically elected president. He didn't really care, but he learned a lesson that, hey, I have to at least appear to be democratic. So he then cloaked himself as a Democrat, was not allowed to run in the next election in 2013, but then in 2018 came back to run against the president that he had overthrown, and trounced him pretty handily by a double-digit margin in 2018. So the guy who overthrew the president in 2009 came back and won democratically in 2018, is still the president today, and will be most likely reelected next year in a presidential election.
Did you get a chance, or either of those two, did you get a chance to speak with either of them in your
Yeah,
interviews?
I spoke to the older guy, the former president. He agreed to talk to me. He was
So
he was still
what
very bitter about it.
so what are your obviously you and I have not spoke before, but just from your kind of demeanor and vibe, I would say that probably you could get a pretty good idea of, and also being a lawyer, of whether or not somebody is full of nonsense.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the situation, right? Because you've got they both have, I would say it sounds like in their eyes legitimate gripes with the other one, but does it seem like they care more about the other guy or like the people, or kind of what are your thoughts, like when you sit down with this guy, like
Mhm.
what is your take on him?
Yeah, like I said, he was still bitter. He thought he had gotten a raw deal, that the country was moving forward when he was president, and that part of the problems of Madagascar today stem from the fact that he was overthrown. The other guy, I didn't get a chance to speak to the current president, Rodswell. I didn't get a chance to speak to him, but I spoke to a lot of his aides and people who work for him, and they claimed that he was over it. I find that a little hard to believe, but the fact that he sort of won all of the direct head-to-head contests with Mark,
Hmm.
that's a little bit of evidence that maybe he is over it. Once when you come out on top of those sorts of rivalries, you can be a little bit more magnanimous, right? Than if you're the loser and you're bitter about it for years. So I think there's a little bit of difference um, between the two of them. I think Madagascar is historically a corrupt place, and so I don't know if either of them were totally devoted to the interests of their people. Um, and so I think there are fair questions about the current president, you know, how much he wants to develop Madagascar, um, how much of his concern is holding on to power, maybe amassing some wealth for himself on the side. All of those questions I think are fair in a place like Madagascar.
Yeah, that's always interesting because every leader in every country has, they're human, so they have their own self-interests. And it's really just kind of how much do they indulge in those self-interests versus the interests of what they were elected for. And it seems like there's never, I can't think of a leader off the top of my head that was 100% selfless and like, you know what, I'm making this decision is horrible for me as a person, but for everyone else, it's great. And I can't think of one where they're like, nah, I'm not gonna do that because that would be bad for me.
Yeah.
Um, that's so interesting. I did hear, I was listening to a podcast recently, and somebody said something along the lines of like, if you can't, basically was they're speaking to kind of the situation in the US in terms of how the the corruption, quote unquote, is accessible only to the highest levels of people, right? You look at somebody like, not to get to people who are in Congress and they're trading stocks and nobody cares because like they won't do anything about it and they won't vote them out. But then you look at somebody, a place like Madagascar, and the corruption seems to be accessible to more normal people in terms of you get pulled over by the cop and you give them 50
Mhm.
bucks and then you don't get in trouble. When you were there on your study abroad trip and your subsequent trips, how did you experience any of, was that anything that you saw, or if I'm not going to say if you partook in, you don't have to say that, but like was that something that you saw or witnessed or that sort of thing? Because there's a certain truth to that where if I'm just a regular guy and maybe I got in trouble speeding one time and I got caught again, it's like maybe that would not be good for me, but if I can just give the cop $50 and it's okay, like there's kind of a
Yeah.
weird nuance within that. What was your experience with that?
Yeah, I saw a lot of corruption. I tried to stay away from it myself as much as possible. But
Of course.
one interesting interview I did was with a policeman. You just mentioned a policeman in the United States that maybe would take $50 to not give you a ticket. So I interviewed a
Well,
policeman
not in the U.S. Somewhere else, I think.
somewhere else. Okay. Um, but this policeman, he made most of his money through corruption, more money on the side than through his official duties. Um, and he was honest about that. He said, "Look, I make so little money as a public servant, as a policeman in Madagascar, that I can't live. I have to extort a little bit of money from the populace. They expect that from me. They don't get mad at me. I mean, a little bit, but they know that that's how I live. He has to pay his like commanding officer every month a certain amount of money from the corruption that he brings in. So his boss not only tolerates but expects him to rake in some extra cash that he can then fork over to his boss. So those are the kind of pressures that he faces as a policeman. But yeah, every time I took a bus trip, for example, from let's say the south of the island back up to the north, we'd have to stop every 20, 30, 50 miles at a checkpoint. And built into the price of the ticket was the driver having to pay the policeman on the side of the road every time we stopped. And again, that's how the policeman made his money. So those are sort of the small scale, low level types of corruption you see every day. Some of the anger surrounding corruption in Madagascar comes from the fact that while the president has tried to crack down on corruption in Madagascar, he hasn't really gone after some of the high level officials or members of parliament who are suspected, even accused of being corrupt. He's really focused on lower level people, and that has engendered some bitterness among the populace who say, "Wait, why are you picking on these people? You should really go after the big fish. That would make more of a splash."
Yeah. Well, obviously he won't do that because they helped him get in there. But
Yeah, right.
oh yeah, that human nature is so weird where it's like in a place like that it's just expected and it's normal and whether or not it's right morally, it's just part of what exists and that it's like that. And so I think people in the US are very blessed that we don't have to deal with that on a regular basis and it's so commonplace other places where people here are like, really? You would give the guy $50 and not give you a ticket? And it's like, yeah, it's normal. It's like it just
Right.
goes to I was talking with one of my friends yesterday actually on the podcast. So he did a basically one-way ticket to New Zealand and he was just like, I'm just gonna figure it out when I get there. He did it both New Zealand and Europe. And he experienced not really the corruption level, but kind of just the story he told was he was just because he had basically no money, he was making peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and he was with some guys from Europe, and they were like, "That's really weird." And he was like, "Have none of you ever had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich before?" And they're like, "No." It's like the culture shock of like everything in America is so like U.S. centric, and then you go somewhere else, and little
Right.
things that you take for granted are just not a thing somewhere else. It's very eye opening. I think travel helps with that
Oh, for sure.
so much. Did you travel often before your first trip to Madagascar, or was
Yeah,
that your
yeah.
first foray?
Well, the first one when I was in college, yeah, that was really my first trip abroad. But since then, I've been all over the world. I told you I'm in Mexico right now, working on something. So yeah, I love to travel into, 25, 30, even more countries around the world. So it's eye-opening and you learn a lot. One other story I'll just tell you about corruption. So one of the more interesting people I met and I got to interview was a general in the army, and he took part in the overthrow of the president that I just talked about in 2009. He was
Mm.
one of the military officers who took part in that. And so I got a meeting with him through a friend in Madagascar. And as soon as I sat down with him and thought we were going to start the interview, he said, okay, can you give me $500 for this? I was like, wait a second. I'm just, I pled the poor journalist story. I said, I don't have $500. I can't do that. I thought we were just going to do this for free and you were going to tell me your story. And he was adamant that he had to have something if he was going to talk to me. So we bargained him down quite a bit till it was pretty minimal. But that's just how the culture is. If you're going to, do something for someone else, um, especially if it's a foreigner, you're probably going to expect some money for that.
That's very interesting. I want to keep with the general for a little bit, because the military, in every sort of situation you get in where somebody wants to overthrow somebody else, the military is the most important. Whoever controls that basically wins because they have all the guns. So this guy, what was his, if you could maybe touch on some important points or some really interesting things that you took away from the conversation with him, because I whether or not you're reading a story that's fiction or reading up on history, oftentimes it seems like they can basically have like almost a decision on who wins that sort of that duel between the two people, because they know that they've got the guns. So if they can be like, nah, I don't really want to help you overthrow this guy, or
Mhm.
yeah, maybe we could get rid of this guy.
Yeah.
It seems like, so what was his story like?
Yeah, so he told a really interesting story because he was trying to walk a fine line when he was talking to me, because a lot of people in Madagascar still don't want to call what happened in 2009 a coup d'etat by
Mm.
the military, because that has such negative connotations and it really tarnishes the current president that he came to power in a coup d'etat. What they would try to tell me, people who supported him, was that this was a popular revolt or a people's movement. They would call it something like that. And what happened right before the overthrow, there was a huge march on the presidential palace. And the president's, his security guards got scared because the crowd was coming closer and closer to the palace, and they started shooting people. So almost 40 people died that day. And what the general told me, he's like, look, people were outraged at the president at that time for what happened that day. They wanted him gone. And so we weren't really picking sides. We were just exercising the people's will and removing a president who had massacred his own people. Now, that's a little bit of revisionist history, as I found, because the deeper you look into it, there were close ties between the current president who overthrew him, and the military. But nobody really likes to talk about that because, I said, it really tarnishes the current president's reputation. So when I was talking to the general that day, he was trying to walk a fine line and say, look, we weren't the power behind the throne. We weren't picking sides. We were just supporting the people of Madagascar, and they wanted a new president.
It's always those inconvenient little facts that try to get swept under the rug. It's
Right.
wild. I want to touch on a few more of the talking points, and then I want to get into the kind of your law stuff with how you ended up where you were, because that's a very interesting shift on
Mhm.
life, I'd say. So the all right, so I think we've touched a good portion of the political stuff, but you've mentioned that the youngest generation can't, like, there's no jobs for them, but then also that the southern half of the island is kind of has a bunch of droughts, and so I want to combine those a bit and to say, what is the economy like? What is it based off? Is it based tourism, vanilla, the thing you mentioned earlier, and then also, like, this very, you already mentioned the southern and the northern half of the island. Some countries or islands have, they split it into various sections, but this one, is there a very distinct half, like very distinct divider between the north and southern half, and then are those economies and climates, I guess, different?
Well, first, I would say ethnically and economically, the real split is between the center of the country, what are called the highlands, the plateaus high up in the center of Madagascar,
Hmm.
and the coastal areas all around the island. This is a generalization, but Madagascar is a mix of two kinds of people, Asians and Africans. The Asians settled the highland plateaus, and that's where they mostly live. And that is the more fertile region of Madagascar. That's where the capital city is. So they have more control, more power than the coastal regions. But what's really interesting about Madagascar from, I guess, geographical perspective is what you mentioned about the south. The southern half of the island is really a different universe. And part of that is what's going on with climate change. Um, Southern Madagascar is the hottest, the driest area of the island. And so it's facing increasingly severe droughts that are getting worse and worse, it seems, every year. Very hard to grow crops, not enough water for drinking, for farming, for doing much else. And so the level of desperation in southern Madagascar is very high. I took a couple of bus trips back and forth across southern Madagascar just to get a sense of things, to interview people, to write about it. And man, I want to tell you, it was a tough place. Haven't been to too many places where the situation was that dire. I mean, just the lack of water. People think about that every single day when they wake up, like, how am I going to get fresh water? When things are really bad, people are eating cactus just in place of their traditional crops. But the future of the southern half of the island is very precarious. No one really has a good answer of what to do about it because it is, in some areas, heavily populated and the population is growing. So, there's a very real chance that a big famine could hit southern Madagascar sometime in the near future because of this lack of water intensified by climate change.
And I assume not much is being done about this by the current
Right,
government.
right. That's one of the areas where we say how much they really care about the people. A lot of people in the south of Madagascar will tell you there's not much interest from the capital about what happens in the south. They say the right things, but they're really leaving it up to the international community. All these aid workers, these agencies, international agencies, are based in the south, like the UN World Food Program, Save the Children. All of those types of groups are heavily represented in southern Madagascar to try to stave off famine. But as people told me, if there's a really severe water shortage, there's not really anything anyone can do. People are going to die there.
That's not fun.
Yeah.
Wow. I don't really have a lot more to say about that. It just seems like we've seen this story so many times throughout history, and it's so unfortunate because every single time, I think you can attest to this through your various travels, like every time you're like, wow, we wish we could do something different, but then you end up in a situation where there's a few people that have some power, and then you gotta bribe somebody else to do this, and then nobody actually cares about that village down the road, and we just end up in this situation time and time again. And I don't even know. I don't know.
Yeah. So one interesting solution that people threw out to me when I was there was desalination of seawater. I mean,
Hmm.
Madagascar is an island, right? So they're surrounded by the ocean. Lots of water is right off the coast of Madagascar. And if you could find a way to take the salt out of it, make it fresh water, that would be one solution. The problem is, and they're turning to other countries to help them. Other like desert, like countries like Israel, for example, is advising Madagascar on what to do in the south. But the problem is it's so expensive to build that technology and all that infrastructure across this wide swath of southern Madagascar that there's very little of that going on right now. But that's just one potential long-term solution that people threw out to me as I was down there. So that was one interesting take.
How big is the island? Like, how difficult would it be for people to just kind of like gradually leave and go to
Yeah,
the more northern parts?
yeah, I think that's a real possibility because the island is the size of Texas,
Hmm.
fourth largest island in the world, and there's a lot of excess space, in different parts of the island. So, just moving the population north is, I guess, one alternative. That would be a huge undertaking, a huge operation. Some people wouldn't want to go
Of course.
because even though, uh, situation's desperate, that's their home. They don't want to leave. That's where they're from. That's where their culture is. But yeah, I guess that would be one situation. And that's actually happening from the interior of the South. a lot of people are moving to the big cities on the coast of the South and
Hmm.
looking for work there. At least there's some, basic economic infrastructure. They can look for jobs, as laborers, as hairdressers, as taxi drivers, things like that. So the interior of the south of the island is being depopulated, I would say, to some extent, and people are heading for the coast.
Well, I guess that's positive for the time being. That's really interesting. I've the deep dive that you've taken into the history, because there's so many people, like myself included, and like, okay, I'll get interested in a subject and I'll find one book and then I'll kind of read that book and I'll be like, okay, that's fine. But because of the fact that there wasn't a book that you found, you took it upon yourself to write your own. What, so there's two parts to this question is one, had you authored anything before? And if not, what was that experience like for the first time? And two, what kind of gripped you to really do that? Because there's plenty of times where like, yeah, I couldn't find something on this subject, but I can find a little bit here and there and maybe ask somebody and then that'll be the end of it. But to write to go through the hey, I'm going to interview this general or hey, I'm going to interview the former president and pull some strings and travel back down there and put myself at, like that's a lot of like that's a very conscious like I'm
Yeah.
going to undertake this massive thing. So what walk us through that process and then the authoring process as well.
Yeah. So I'll start with the authoring process. So that was a lot of hard work. I mean, I got back from, I figured I would do it in two stages. One, I would just go to Madagascar, do the research, take some notes and record some interviews, and then come back and write it. Um, Seemed like a good way to start. So when I got back, I had all this material, and then it was just a matter of sitting down. I was still working at the time, so I would do this on the weekends typically, and just do like 2 or 3 hours on Saturday, 2 or 3 hours on Sunday, and just knock out as much as I could and try to organize it. Um, so it wasn't glamorous at all. It was just a lot of work and editing and rewriting and thinking about how am I going to organize this. And then, publishing a book on Madagascar is not easy because there's not a huge market for that. So that took some time to find the right publisher, one that wanted to publish the book in the way that I wanted it to be published, basically the way I had written it. So that took some time as well. Luckily, I found a really good publisher in London that was willing to do that. Um, and then the second part of your question was, the time investment and
Yeah, so there's well, so that I'll add another little wrinkle into that is I know you were curious about
yeah,
the island itself. What was it always like, hey, I'm gonna go down to do the research for a book, or was it I'm gonna go do the research and then maybe I should write a book later? And then so that part, but then the second part was the conscious of like I'm gonna go do this like it's so much easier to just not do things than to
right,
do them generally. So you were like, you know what, I'm gonna go to Madagascar. I'm gonna get interviews with all these people. I'm gonna put myself at
yeah,
risk. I'm gonna go visit these places and do all this traveling and obviously traveling is expensive as well.
right.
What was the motivating factor for you to actually pull the trigger and really do that?
Yeah, so, I enjoy being a lawyer. It's a good way to make a living, but it's honestly not something I wanted to do for my whole life. And I've always been interested in the world, in foreign affairs. Having gone to Madagascar as a student certainly helped with that. So I was always kind of thinking about something else that I would like to do. The job I was working at, the company I was representing in like 2018, 19, they were going through bankruptcy. And so there was like a hard stop to that job for me. And so I had some time leading up to it to think about, what do I want to do next? Do I want to go straight into another law job or do I want to go? And I said, I haven't been to Madagascar in a while. I love visiting that place. I need to go back. Um, I think I'd like to maybe try to write something about Madagascar because I know a lot about it. There's not a lot about out there about it. And then I made a couple contacts before I went, and they said, "Hey, my family's actually friends with Senator X, or my cousin is the head of this company Y that is one of the largest supporters of the president. He can probably get you a meeting with him. And so as things came together, at first it was, I don't want to say a pipe dream, but it was kind of an idea that didn't have a strong plan of action behind it. But, certain things come together if they were meant to. And so when I landed in Madagascar, I already had a couple key interviews set up. I had an itinerary laid out of where I wanted to go and who I wanted to talk to, the issues I wanted to cover, like climate change in the South. And it all sort of worked out. I mean, I was traveling by myself. I really wasn't getting advice from anybody on how to write this book. It was a one-man show, and I loved it. It was great.
I often find that with people who've started their own thing, whether it's you authoring a book or several people I know are in the kind of the personal training fitness industry.
Right.
It often comes with their quote unquote regular job has decided that they're no longer needed or there's a change of scenery, and they've basically been like, you know what, I've been thinking about this. This is the kick in the ass that life
Yeah.
has given me. I might as well do this because if I don't do it now, then I'm not going to. Um, that's really cool that you decided to do that. Do you, if you don't want to answer this question, don't answer the question, but can I ask why you're in Mexico at the moment? Do you have other stuff planned?
Yeah, yeah. So traveling and writing is like I said, a lot more fun than practicing law, in my opinion. So I'm in Chiapas, which is the southernmost state of Mexico, and is the most indigenous state in Mexico. And it's a place that I've always heard about, place I've always wanted to visit. This is my first time here. So I'm actually going to try, just as a freelance journalist again, not to write a book, but like a travel article about Chiapas, what's going on here. Some of the big tourist sites, I'll cover those, but also more from like a political or social perspective. What is Chiapas like? So I'm down here for a month working on that.
That's really cool. And I think you have an interesting perspective as well, because there's not really many lawyers that decide that they're going to do that. So bringing that sort of, and I have one or two friends that I've spoken with about like taking the bar in law school and like how
Yeah,
much writing you actually have to do. So you have sort of a unique like way of looking at different situations that I think for this book, just for your book on Madagascar and some of the stuff that I skimmed over is written in a way that is actually quite interesting from somebody who, right, you say you're interested in foreign affairs as well. It's got a very unique perspective that I actually really enjoyed. Um, so is that kind of been your thing to figure out places that there's not a lot of literature on and then be
yeah,
like, yeah, I'll go here and start write about it.
right, for sure. Yeah, I mean, there's a million things you could go online and books about France and Britain and Germany, Japan, places like that. China's the hot one right now. Everybody's interested in China. So yeah, I do tend to gravitate towards the less developed countries, the places that people don't know a lot about. Out of personal curiosity, I would just like to know more. And so, if I have a chance to go visit them, great. At the very least, I'm going to read about them. And if those two things come together, and I can go to a place like Chiapas or Madagascar and write something that people would find interesting, then I would love to do that. So this is sort of maybe becoming a second career for me. And if that's the case, I'd be thrilled because it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to go to these places, meet people, and try to create a story out of these people's lives.
Yeah, for sure. Because nobody knows about these places because these are not places that people are like, yeah, let me just go look at Chapas. Like no, like nobody does that.
Right.
Where did you gravitate to these sorts of places from when you were younger, or was this developed after that first trip to Madagascar?
After the first trip, so I grew up in Ohio,
Hmm.
not the most cosmopolitan place in the United States, and didn't really, we took vacations to Florida, but we didn't really go outside of the country. So before I went to Madagascar as a college student, I had never really been anywhere. And that was such an eye-opening experience that, I mean, life-changing is really the only way I can describe it. That I said, wow, this is just one out of 181 countries. I mean, think of all the other cool places like Madagascar that are out there that I need to explore. So I've had the chance to explore a fair number of them. I've been in South America, for example, Central America, every country except two. And those two I hope to get to in the next few years. A few places in Africa, a few places in Asia. So I guess I would consider myself well traveled by now, but still a lot of places left to check off the list.
I mean, I would say you're well traveled, to be totally honest. So what's next? Is that kind of what the next few years holds for you? If you had like a, I see myself with another book published, and I've checked off those last two countries in South
Yeah.
America. Where are you at in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah. So one interesting thing I've done during my travels is start a few small businesses as well. Using my sort of business legal training, I was a business lawyer representing companies for all those years, to start businesses that I think would make a little money, and also to help people who I meet in my travels who just need a little bit of financing. So I've done that in a few places, and my hope is that and my writing will be enough to pay the bills, so to speak, over the next 3 to 5 years. But that would be the goal: is to visit more countries, to go off the beaten path even further, to write about places that people don't know about, but maybe they should or would like to know about, and get a fresh perspective on the world from that perspective.
Yeah, do you want to touch on your businesses a little bit?
Yeah, so some of them are doing well, some of them not so well, but I'll touch on both of them. Um, so when I was in Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, I was on the smaller island of Tobago and was talking to this taxi driver, really cool guy. He was my taxi driver for the whole week while I was down there, and he was telling me that they need more transportation on the island. So long story short, I invested in a small taxi company on the island of Tobago. He's running it for me. He's a great guy, totally honest. Um, in the country of Colombia, I bought a large tract of land outside of one of the major cities, and I'm developing like an Airbnb, like it's going to be like a big house with
Hmm.
several different units that I can rent out. Um, and then in Madagascar, I mentioned vanilla. I've got a small vanilla farm in northern Madagascar, and we'll see if that actually looks very promising. We'll see if that pans out. So, give me a few years, but I think between the three of those, um, like I said, hopefully I'll be able to pay the bills.
Yeah, I would say so. That's really cool. When you start to look at things in that way, and you've got the eye for business as you do, right? You take something innocuous like the taxi driver is like, oh, you need more transportation. You're like, oh, really?
Right.
Let's see if we can do something here. It kind of,
Yeah.
I've started to look at life a little bit like that in the last, say, year or year and a half and some change. Obviously, COVID, I've had more time to read up on different things, and it's uh it's eye-opening to say the least, both with the traveling and then just different perspectives on life, really. So where can the people want to get your book, or where can the people find you online? You've got social media, or
Yeah, I'm on Facebook. Nate Adams is where you can find me, but really the place to find the book is on Amazon. The Tragedy of Madagascar by Nathaniel Adams. It's up on Amazon already. I think the official release date is December 1st. So depending on when this interview airs, it'll be a couple weeks after that. Um, yeah, I encourage people to read it. It's written in a style I think that will appeal to the general reader as well as people who are really interested in developing countries. Not, certainly if they're interested in Madagascar, they'll find a lot to learn.
for sure. Well, people, I will put the link in the description to that as always. And I really appreciate your time. I really enjoyed the conversation, learned a lot. I think it's always good to kind of, even if you don't make it your life goal as you have, but just to poke around in some of these less traveled places just to see what's out there. Because at the end of the day, there's people everywhere, and so it's always important to kind of learn and take in other people's stories. It helps with the life perspective for sure. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric.
All right, guys, we'll see you guys next time. Peace.